A group of peasants are gathering around a dozen coffins performing a memorial ceremony. Their hands are tattooed with star and crescent patterns, and each person grabs a handful of soil and sprinkles it on the corpses in the coffins. And these dead people are all their children. Just a short while ago, an American wiped out all their descendants. The patriarch, grieving the loss of his son, swears to the villagers that he will definitely bring that man back here to take revenge for their children. At this time, this man named Bryan is on a business trip in Istanbul, the largest city in Turkey. Having just finished a 3-day security job for a Middle Eastern tycoon, he received a thick envelope from the client. Several large denomination dollar bills in the envelope made Bryan chuckle involuntarily. It seems the sheik's money is indeed easy to earn. Just as he was about to call his family to report the good news, someone suddenly called him from behind. Bryan looked back and was surprised to find his beautiful daughter Kim appearing in front of him, and his ex-wife Lenor had also come. It turned out these two women wanted to give him a surprise, and Bryan was naturally very happy. Bryan booked a room with the best view for the mother and daughter, where they could see the beautiful and unique architecture of Istanbul. After settling them in, Bryan returned to his own room. He stayed in room 612, but due to years of professional habit, he also booked the room next door, and his weapons and equipment were all hidden in this room. It was precisely because of this habit that his daughter's life was saved later on. Bryan changed into casual clothes and went to the hotel lobby to wait for his family. A man talking on the phone caught his attention. Even in a resting state, Bryan did not relax his vigilance at all. Finally waiting for Kim to come downstairs, Bryan prepared to take the mother and daughter out to play, but unexpectedly Kim didn't want to go out and only wanted to swim in the hotel. Bryan didn't suspect anything, but Lenor knew this was an opportunity the daughter deliberately created for them to be alone, wanting to bring the two together to remarry. Bryan left the hotel. A man in the lobby dialed a phone number. He notified the leader, Murad. Bryan and Lenor got into the reserved car. Just as they were recalling the past, Bryan suddenly discovered a car following them behind. He hurriedly asked the driver to turn the car into a crowded small road, using pedestrians to block the following car from getting close. The battle-hardened Bryan had no time to explain to Lenor. Knowing the terrain of Istanbul very well, he told Lenor the escape route and asked her to go back and find their daughter. At this moment, Lenor was already scared silly, but Bryan had no time for her to digest the nervous mood. He asked the driver to stop quickly, let Lenor leave first, and he would deal with the people behind himself. Lenor kissed Bryan before parting. This woman finally revealed her true feelings at the time of life and death separation. Bryan also got out of the car, pulled the driver away without explanation, stepped on the gas, and drove away. The people slowly tracking behind saw they were discovered by Bryan, so they no longer continued to disguise themselves and quickly sped up to chase. Bryan dialed Kim's number while weaving through the narrow alleys, but at this time, Kim was swimming in the pool and couldn't answer. Bryan drove into a small road and his line of sight happened to be blocked by a cart piled with goods at the intersection. Watching the enemy's vehicle drive past the intersection, Bryan thought he had shaken off the enemy, but he didn't expect another enemy car to block the way. The enemies frantically fired at Bryan's car. Bryan reversed and crashed head-on into a Mercedes at the intersection, sandwiched front and back. The bandits in the two cars surrounded Bryan's car with guns, but when they opened the door, they found it empty. Bryan had long since disappeared. He ran on the intricate streets. The enemies had already spotted him, and several big men were chasing closely behind. Bryan just ran to an open space when a gun was pointed at his head, but he was not afraid. He grabbed the opponent backhand and started to counterattack. After knocking down two enemies, two more pounced on him. Bryan felt that fighting a war of attrition like this was not the way, and his physical strength would run out sooner or later. He grabbed one person, pointed a gun at his head, and threatened the other party not to approach. But unexpectedly, the enemy was more ruthless, directly shooting and killing his own man. It seemed they were determined to catch him, and at this time, something that made Bryan even more heart-wrenching appeared. Lenor was grabbed by her hair and brought over. Seeing the situation was wrong, Bryan immediately took out his phone and dialed his daughter Kim's number again. At this time, Kim was chatting hotly with her lover. Smiling like a flower, she saw the call from her father, so she picked it up. But as soon as she heard her father Bryan's voice, her face immediately changed, because her father's serious and cold tone was exactly the same as when she was kidnapped in Paris a year ago. Bryan told Kim that his situation was very bad now, and someone had already gone to find her. He told Kim to immediately go next door to his room and hide in the closet. After speaking, Bryan hung up the phone and smashed it with one foot. Seeing Lenor in the other party's hands, Bryan could only put down the pistol. His wife and daughter were his greatest weaknesses. The kidnappers who had just been beaten by him surrounded him, punching and kicking him. Bryan and Lenor were hooded and taken into a car. On the other side, after listening to the phone call, although Kim was very panicked after the event in Paris last time, she had also grown up and was no longer a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. And at this time, sure enough, several kidnappers had already arrived at the hotel. The lobby manager had long been bribed by them and handed them the key card to Kim's room. Several kidnappers broke into the room and did not find Kim, so they decided to go to Bryan's room to look. At this moment, Kim had already run to room 612. She tried to open the door to the next room but found it was jammed and couldn't be opened. In desperation, she opened the window. Now to survive, she could only climb out the window. The eaves outside the window were only a few dozen centimeters wide. Kim moved slowly close to the wall, and any carelessness would result in her being smashed to pieces. At this moment, several kidnappers had already entered Bryan's room, and one of them saw the slippers left in front of the window. He hurriedly leaned out the window to look to both sides, while Kim had just opened the window of the next room and entered the room a second earlier. But this did not mean she was safe because the kidnapper also climbed out the window. He was also going to the next room. Kim hid in the closet, as Bryan said. But at this time, she heard a man also jump into the room. The kidnapper searched everywhere in the room and finally locked his eyes on the closet, but he opened the closet door and didn't find anyone. It turned out Kim was hiding behind the suits on the side. She was so scared she didn't dare to breathe. The kidnapper closed the closet door. Just as he was about to open the closet on Kim's side, gunfire from the other side attracted him away. Kim finally escaped a disaster. On the other side, Bryan was locked in a truck and transported away. Although his head was covered and he couldn't see anything, in order to survive, he began to silently count following the ticking of his watch, pausing at every turn, and then recounting so as to memorize the track the truck traveled. And in order to strengthen the accuracy of the route, he would memorize the unique sounds along the way, such as bird calls, the sound of an old man playing the violin by the roadside, etc. Finally, the truck drove in front of Murad. After confirming the person he wanted had been caught, Murad asked people to send Bryan to the workshop. Murad was also very cautious in doing things. He would not put the prisoner and his base camp together. The final destination arrived. Bryan opened his eyes and found himself locked in an abandoned warehouse. He struggled to stand up, scraped his leg hard with his foot, and then scraped out the miniature phone he had been hiding in his sock. As a veteran CIA agent, hiding communication equipment on his body at all times is also one of the skills to save his life. He tried to use his shoe to hook the phone and lift it to his hand, but unexpectedly failed the first time. There was no way. He could only try again. When he finally got the phone in his hand, he quickly dialed Kim's number again. After confirming his daughter was safe now, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. He told Kim to go directly to the US Embassy. She would be safe there. But Kim heard that Bryan's situation seemed very bad. He didn't seem to have full confidence to ensure he and her mother would return safely. Kim immediately decided to save him, because now, apart from her, Bryan had no other reliance. This girl who used to cry whenever she encountered danger, her eyes became unusually firm at this moment. Having experienced so many things, she had finally grown up. Bryan couldn't refuse his daughter and eventually agreed to let her help. Bryan asked Kim to find his large suitcase, which was full of his various weapons and equipment. He asked Kim to open the map, take the hotel as the center, and draw a circle with a diameter of 3 kilometers according to the scale of the map. Then draw a similar circle with the famous Grand Bazaar as the center. But these two circles did not have a focal point. Bryan knew his distance calculation was wrong. He asked Kim to take a grenade out of the suitcase and throw it to an unoccupied safe place. Kim took a fancy to a rooftop parking lot, where only one car was parked lonely. So she threw the grenade with all her might, as Bryan said. The propagation speed of sound is about 340 meters per second. Bryan calculated the approximate distance through the time the sound reached his ears. He asked Kim again to draw a circle with a diameter of 5 kilometers with the hotel as the center on the map. This time the two circles finally had focal points, and there were 2 points, and Bryan's position was on one of the focal points. He asked Kim to go to the window to see the direction the roof flags were fluttering. They were all fluttering to the east, and finally determined that Bryan's position was at the intersection of the 2 circles closer to the east. With an approximate area, now it was to determine the specific location. Bryan asked Kim to bring a pistol and 2 grenades and stand by on the roof. At this moment, in order to rescue her parents, Kim transformed into a temporary trainee female agent. She quickly came to the hotel basement, stole a set of someone else's clothes, and left the hotel as Bryan said. At this time, Bryan heard movement outside the cell. He hurriedly threw the phone behind him and buried it with rubble. Sure enough, someone entered the cell. It was Murad. He took out a stack of photos and showed them to Bryan one by one. And the men in these photos were all taken out by Bryan, one of whom was Murad's son. He wanted to take Bryan back to the countryside of Albania to let the clansmen vent the pain of losing their sons. Even though Murad knew his son died because he kidnapped Bryan's daughter, suffering in his heart, he just wanted revenge. He wanted to let Bryan personally feel the taste of losing a loved one. He asked his men to bring Lenor in, then made a cut on her neck with a small knife, and finally hung her upside down. All of Lenor's blood would slowly drain out through the wound, and she would die in 30 minutes. And Murad wanted to let Bryan witness Lenor die in front of him with his own eyes. After these people left, Bryan called Lenor's name loudly, but Lenor didn't move, only dripping blood continuously. Time was tight. Bryan had to break free from the restraints quickly. He endured the severe pain, used the metal sheet on the stone pillar to cut the restraints on his hands, and saved Lenor, who was hanging upside down. At this time, Lenor was unconscious, but fortunately, Bryan stopped her bleeding. At this time, Kim had run to the roof of the Grand Bazaar. The father and daughter spoke on the phone again. Bryan asked Kim to throw another grenade. The sound of the explosion allowed Bryan to determine that Kim was nearby. He asked Kim to continue walking east, count to 30, and throw another grenade. Meanwhile, Bryan also started to act. He opened the steam valve of the hot water pipe in the warehouse, and at this time, Kim threw another grenade. Bryan asked Kim to quickly look for white steam. Meanwhile, the sound of 2 explosions also alerted these terrorists. Several kidnappers decided to go to the roof to see what the situation was. Kim on the roof saw the chimney emitting a large amount of white steam at a glance. Bryan asked Kim to come over quickly and throw the pistol into the chimney. At this time, the kidnapper responsible for guarding Bryan felt the situation was suspicious and decided to go to the dungeon to check. Just as Kim ran wildly to the vicinity of the chimney, several terrorists also appeared on the roof. She quickly threw the pistol down, then turned and ran. Although this Beretta 92 FS pistol fell in front of Bryan, the magazine fell under the pipe. At this time, the 2 kidnappers had arrived at the cell door. After Bryan took them out, he decided to go out to rescue Kim first, and then come back to take Lenor away. Little did he know, this decision of his almost separated them by life and death. In the room upstairs, several terrorists were watching a ball game with excitement, shouting and yelling. One of them went out to throw out the trash but had a gun held to his head. Bryan was merciless, eliminating the enemies in the room. Subsequently, he climbed to the roof. At this time, Kim was being chased closely by the kidnappers. She fled on the high and low roofs, but found she had reached a dead end with nowhere to go. The relentless kidnapper pointed his pistol at her. Completely at a loss, Kim could only kneel down obediently, begging him not to kill her. However, with a gunshot, the kidnapper fell to the ground instantly. Bryan arrived. Seeing her father again felt like a lifetime ago for Kim, and she became that little daughter who needed to rely on her father again. Although they were safe now, Lenor was still in a dangerous place. Bryan took Kim and hijacked a local taxi, then drove near the warehouse. He only gave Kim 5 minutes. If he didn't return after 5 minutes, Kim must leave and go to the U.S. Embassy. Bryan returned to the cell where he was held, only to find Lenor was no longer there. It turned out Lenor had been taken away. Bryan followed the small road to chase quickly, but was still a step too late. When he arrived, Lenor had been put into a car and driven away in a flash. At this time, Kim was anxiously waiting for her father. A police officer had arrived at the warehouse door, but he was a corrupt officer, talking on the phone with Murad. At this time, 5 minutes were up and Bryan appeared at the door, but he did not bring back Lenor. Bryan saw the police officer standing in front. He originally wanted to get in the car quietly, but the sound of Kim starting the car alerted the police officer, so Bryan could only swiftly resolve the police officer. This place should not be stayed in for long. Bryan asked Kim to drive directly to the embassy. Now the police in Istanbul had been bought. Nowhere was safe for them except the embassy. The yellow taxi they drove now became the target wanted by the whole city's police. Police cars were chasing and intercepting them everywhere. Under her father's guidance, Kim raced closely with police cars on the narrow stone streets of Istanbul. No technique was needed. Just be bold and ruthless enough, and ram hard. Apart from police cars, the enemy's car was chasing closely behind, constantly shooting. Seeing Kim drive to an intersection, just like that, with the miraculous cooperation of the father and daughter, they took out a terrorist car behind them. However, enemies behind were still chasing continuously. The father and daughter could only speed wildly again. Under Bryan's command, Kim drove the car to a railway crossing. At this time, an old-fashioned train was speeding over. Under Bryan's encouragement, Kim slammed on the accelerator and rushed over. But the pursuers behind didn't have such good luck. They were hit directly by the train, eventually exploding into a fireball. Kim sped all the way to the front of the U.S. Embassy. The embassy gate was heavily guarded, and Kim didn't dare to barge in. but Bryan told her not to be afraid and rushed directly. At this time at the gate, seeing the situation was wrong, the soldiers picked up heavy machine guns and fired wildly. Seeing this, the father and daughter lowered their heads and then rushed straight through. The taxi rushed into the embassy and stopped in front of the building. Bryan told his daughter not to show her head, because once she showed her head, she would be sniped on the spot. Subsequently, he made another phone call to his old CIA colleague far away in the United States, asking him to help explain to the embassy people not to shoot. Kim knew her mother hadn't been rescued, but Bryan promised her he would definitely bring her mother back, and guaranteed her he would resolve this matter once and for all, so these bad guys would never disturb her again. Kim knew her Superman-like dad was going to venture into the dragon's den again. When the family faces the threat of death, no one can help them through the crisis except this father. He is willing to sacrifice everything for his family, even his own life. This is a love that no lover or partner can replace. Heroic, fearless, and selfless fatherly love. Bryan returned to the chaotic and complex streets of Istanbul. How to find Lenor? He recalled the route he had memorized along the way when he was being kidnapped. He returned to the open space where he was subdued, starting to retrace all the way from this starting point. He got on the ferry, found the corridor with countless bird cages hanging, and saw the old man playing the piano by the roadside. Finally, he found an iron gate by the roadside, where an Eastern European-looking man was smoking inside. Bryan's intuition told him this was the place. He walked in slowly, strangled the man's neck fiercely with a chain, and choked him to death. Bryan took a gun and quietly infiltrated the house. He silently took out the enemy, picked up the opponent's AK-47, and continued to explore forward. In the house on the second floor, several terrorists were resting. One of them was just about to go out. The gunshot alarmed Murad on the third floor, and Lenor was indeed detained here. Murad didn't expect Bryan to find this place. Panicked, he hurriedly took people to leave here while sending men to stop Bryan. A terrorist fired downward, but Bryan took him out with a single shot. Bryan hurriedly ran upstairs. He came behind a wall and suddenly heard the sound of a gunbolt being pulled. Immediately after, two terrorists behind the wall fired wildly with Arsenal SLR-106 machine guns, but they swept for a long time without any reaction from the opposite side, so they carefully went over to check. Bryan finally saw Lenor's trace. Just as he wanted to chase over, unexpectedly a terrorist rushed out from the side door, wanting to launch a sneak attack. Bryan pulled out a discarded door handle as a weapon and took out this terrorist. Bryan chased Murad all the way to the outside of the house. In the crowded crowd, he followed all the way to a Turkish-style bathhouse. He saw Lenor lying on the ground unconscious, and Murad's #1 hitman Suko also flashed out at this time, holding a pistol to confront Bryan. A close-quarters fierce battle unfolded immediately. After a bitter struggle, Bryan was beaten black and blue by Suko. Suko's combat ability was extraordinary. He even used a small knife concealed in his palm, and Bryan was knocked to the ground at one point. Just as Suko wanted to deal the final killing blow, Bryan threw Suko heavily, breaking Suko's neck. After dealing with the enemy, Bryan didn't see Murad's figure. He fished out the phone on Suko and dialed the most recent number. Sure enough, in another bathroom, Murad was hiding right there. Murad thought Bryan would kill him, but unexpectedly Bryan didn't want the situation to escalate further, proposing that if Murad agreed to go home and give up revenge, he would let him live. Murad certainly didn't want to die here and immediately agreed, so Bryan threw his gun on the ground, turned, and walked away silently. But Murad picked up the pistol and pulled the trigger. However, what terrified Murad was that there were no bullets in the gun, because Bryan had already taken out the bullets. Bryan knew Murad would never give up his hatred for him, and finally pierced Murad's body with a sharp towel hook, killing him. Perhaps vendettas will continue, but having no illusions about evildoers and striking with the sharpest methods is the correct way. Bryan found Lenor. He fulfilled his promise and once again rescued his most loved family. 3 weeks later, Bryan sat anxiously on a bench by the roadside. It seemed no mission made him feel more worried than now. It turned out his daughter Kim was taking her driving test today. Kim, who had failed several times, was perfect this time. The instructor satisfiedly gave her a full score. This girl who once rampaged in Istanbul finally had her own driver's license. Everything returned to calm again. Only after experiencing storms will one feel that ordinary life is so sweet and beautiful.